So this part of the PowerPoint is related to radio and how it is today, or really how it has evolved over the last 20 or 30 years. Modern radio technology has evolved primarily because of the development of one very important technological advancement, and that is the transistor. The transistor is something that was developed by Bell Labs. Bell Labs are a subsidiary of AT&T, and this was something that had been in the process for quite a while. The idea was that the audion tubes that were the primary technology of radio up to this point, basically their biggest problem was that they were big, they were bulky, and they were very, very hot. In order to, if you've ever seen an old-fashioned radio, you'll notice that the back is either open or it has boards with holes in it. And this was really in order to keep these audion tubes cool. These vacuum tubes took a lot of energy and they put out a lot of energy because they were, in order to work, they generated a lot of heat. And they were big and they were bulky and they took up a lot of room inside the radio itself. So what technologists were trying to find is something that would do just what the audion tube would do, and again, it's amplify the voice, make the signal strong so that it could be transmitted a long way. And once they had that fixed, that's what we had in the transmitter, or the transistor. The transistor did exactly what the audion tube did, but did it in a much better, more efficient way. The 5 advantages of the transistor is that it's very, very small. Most transistors are no bigger than an eraser on a pencil, smaller than a fingernail. So you can put a lot of them in a very small space. They also use less power, so you didn't have to have a lot of power to generate the signal that you were trying to generate. Probably the biggest advantage is that they generated less heat. Again, the audion tubes, the vacuum tubes, had to be cooled, had to be air cooled when they were turned on. And then, of course, they were much more durable. They lasted much longer, and they were less expensive to produce. Consequently, what they went into, radios and eventually computers and televisions, that mean that those products were less expensive as well. And the immediate effect of this was the development of portable radios, small radios that could be carried in one hand. Instead of having these big, bulky furniture-like radios that could be part of they would have to have their own place in the living room or maybe rest on top of a large piece of furniture. Transistor radios you could take wherever you wanted. They ran on batteries, and you could plug in your earplugs and listen to them personally if you wanted to. They were very convenient to carry with you wherever you went. But of course, they were also being used in newer technologies that were just over the hill as well. They made computers smaller and more powerful. During the 60s and into the 70s, computers could take up entire rooms. The computers that were used by NASA to send men to the moon and during the Gemini and the Mercury and the Apollo space programs, the computers that were being used were filled up several rooms because they had to have those. The part of the components were those those vacuum tubes. They had to have lots of space, and they had to have air conditioning conditions to keep them cool when they were running. The transistor being put into a computer allowed for the computer to sit on a desktop and be as powerful, if not more powerful, than a room full of older computers with vacuum tubes. The next technology is FM radio. At this point, all of radio, for the most part, is AM radio. And so we have to look at what's the difference, primarily what's the difference between AM radio and FM radio. So the AM in AM radio stands for amplitude modulation. You don't really have to know the details of this, just so you know what AM stands for and FM stands for. Amplitude modulation is basically the strength of the carrier wave, how strong it is, what's the level of the strength of the carrier wave. Because the carrier wave is, again, that signal that is sent out into the air, and then attached to it is voices or sounds that are part of the signal that are going out that can be captured by a radio. FM modulation is frequency modulation. That is actually how many waves are in the frequency, or how many waves are in the signal. The more they're spaced out, the fewer the number of waves there are. The less space between the waves, that means that there are more waves included in there. Now, you don't necessarily need to know the difference between amplitude and modulation, AM radio and FM radio, amplitude modulation and frequency modulation, but you do need to know their different advantages and disadvantages. The advantages of AM radio is that AM signals go much farther. Because they have a stronger signal, they cover more distance. And in fact, if you've ever driven late at night and have your radio in your car tuned to an AM station, or you've traveled through the AM dial, you may be in Eau Claire, but you're getting a signal from a radio station in Cincinnati, Ohio. The reason is that the signal coming from that station bounces off the ionosphere, the coating that goes around the Earth, that level of atmosphere that goes around the Earth. It bounces off that and then can come down wherever it lands. So you may be getting, and it's because that signal is so strong. This is also kind of what shortwave radio is as well. Shortwave radio is kind of a hobbyist. This is how military units keep in radio contact with each other. Very powerful shortwave signals that can go long distances from one place to another. The disadvantage of FM radio is that it doesn't go that far. The distance that an FM signal can go is really dependent on the power of the transmitter. In fact, usually for an FM signal to go the same distance as an AM signal, the power of the transmitter has to be double that of an FM signal than the AM signal. So if you have a 50,000 watt AM station, you would have to have a 100,000 watt FM station for the signal to go the same as the AM station. On the other hand, AM stations or AM signals have their disadvantages. One is that they have a very narrow range of sound frequencies. If you've ever listened to an AM station, you will know that the sound is very flat, it's very shallow, kind of tinny sounding, doesn't have a lot of depth to it. On the other hand, the FM signal has a much broader range of signals that it can capture. So FM is really good for music, and we'll see that FM stations really take off in the late 70s and into the 80s, when more and more FM stations start playing music as their format on their for their radio station, and AM stations tend to go with more talk radio because, again, the human voice isn't that complicated. Another disadvantage for AM is that it can be affected by static electricity. In other words, if you are driving in a thunderstorm and you are listening to AM radio, whenever there is a crack of lightning, there's going to be static that's going to interrupt that AM signal that's coming into your radio. On the other hand, if you're listening to an FM station, electricity, thunder, and lightning will not affect that signal. It will stay true and stay quality sounding all the time. The man who really put FM into the consumer market is a man we've already heard about, and this is Edwin Armstrong. As I said, Armstrong is really kind of a underappreciated engineer, developer of radio. He's also a kind of tragic figure as well, and it really has to do with the development of FM radio, where his life becomes a tragedy. Armstrong had been working on FM radio before World War II, and he was working on it with the support of David Sarnoff of RCA. Sarnoff saw this as a viable technology. Armstrong was doing a lot of work in it, and so Sarnoff was providing financial support and technical support for Armstrong as he was trying to advance FM radio. However, by 1935, Sarnoff is recognizing that television is the newest technology on the horizon, and he determines that FM radio may become popular, but television is going to be the next wave of the future. And he also kind of looks at it in a practical sense. He determines that AM radio is still viable. AM radio is still making money for radio stations and networks. So to introduce a new kind of radio, this may not actually be as big a payoff as he thought it would. So he decided to move away from supporting Armstrong in his development of FM radio as he had in the past. Plus, he was pretty convinced that television was the next technology. AM radio was still viable. TV was the next technology that consumers were going to want, and therefore putting money into the development of FM radio was really not cost effective. And so he went about doing some things that would really stifle Armstrong in his efforts to develop FM radio. Armstrong, on the other hand, is trying to continue to develop and market FM radio on his own. He starts putting his own money into building radio stations, into manufacturing FM radio equipment, so that he can actually get it out into the marketplace and potentially make some money to support more development of FM radio. But Sarnoff did really one of the most dastardly things that's ever happened in broadcast management. What Sarnoff did was convince the Federal Communications Commission to change the layout of the radio frequency spectrum. Prior to or during early radio and the early development of television, the radio frequency spectrum was laid out such that AM radio was on the spectrum from 530 kilohertz to 1600 kilohertz. FM radio was on the frequency from 44 megahertz to 50 megahertz. And the FCC had recognized that television was a new technology that was coming. And so the FCC set aside part of the radio spectrum from 88 megahertz to 108 megahertz for television sound to be broadcast. So what Armstrong did was, as he was building his FM stations, as he was manufacturing his radios and his transmitter equipment, he had them designed and built for the radio spectrum between 44 megahertz and 50 megahertz. Well, what Sarnoff did was go to the FCC and convince them to flip FM radio and TV audio frequencies. AM stayed the same at 530 to 1600 kilohertz, but now the FCC changed and moved the television audio spectrum from 88 to 100 megahertz down to 44 to 50 megahertz, and then move the FM spectrum from 88 to 108 megahertz, basically flipping the TV and the FM spectrum. This meant basically disaster for Armstrong, because now the law said that if he wanted to manufacture and have FM signals, they would have to be in between 88 megahertz and 108 megahertz. The problem, of course, is that Armstrong has built his technology for 44 megahertz to 50 megahertz. And basically, Sarnoff, with this FCC change, has put Armstrong completely out of business and eventually bankrupted him. So from now on, Armstrong's technology is no good because it has been built for a frequency that it's not allowed to be on. He can't manufacture, he can't make public his transmitters, and he can't sell his radios because they're useless. They were built for 44 to 50 megahertz, but that's where the television spectrum now is. And so Armstrong is out of business. This, of course, just ruins Armstrong. He files a lawsuit against RCA. RCA turns around and files lawsuits against him. Eventually, he's bankrupted. He is, completely mentally despondent. And in 1954, he kills himself. Unfortunately, he does that before decisions have been made on his lawsuits, because after his death, the courts find that, yes, he has been encumbered by RCA, and therefore he is awarded millions of dollars in financial awards from RCA. His wife gets that money and eventually sells all his patents to RCA anyway. And so, unfortunately, Armstrong doesn't really get to see the legal success that he has, but also he just doesn't get to see the success that FM radio eventually becomes. And FM radio does become extremely successful. As I mentioned, by the 1980s, FM radio is making more money than AM stations simply because of the fact that more FM stations are going to music as their formats. And AM radio is trying to find where its place is going to be, and eventually AM becomes more talk radio, whereas FM goes to more music genres. By the 1990s, 75% of radio listeners say that they prefer FM music to AM, or FM stations to AM stations. Again, simply because that they're more music oriented than talk oriented. So FM really becomes a success story that Edwin Armstrong will not see simply because of the actions of David Sarnoff. But it's also the fact that FM and AM really have distinctly different styles and distinctly different sounds.
Hey, good morning. It's Kip Casey. Wake up time. Driving to work, to school, having breakfast, or just doing some crazy morning things around the house. Casey's on the case. I'm Kip Casey. I'll be here till noon with a few words, a little music, and of course the Pasternak Air Hammer Giveaway Day contest a little later on. Here's a tune to get you moving and grooving on this sunny Friday morning. An old one from Tony Orlando and Don Candida. Some gold. Okay. Yeah, that was the Moody Blues for our morning. Morning, as always, the first awakening. I'm Kenneth Wardell on KLOG FM. Mellowing out your morning with some really good sound. We have music. I'm a little high right now. And I'm looking forward to an interview with Peter Criss, the drummer from Kiss. He's going to tell us how he chose the cat makeup. Here's something new from Aerosmith.
I always like that little clip because it's such a it really shows the difference between AM radio and FM radio. AM radio is high energy. It's just bold. The DJs are fast talking, and they're really into the high energy radio. Whereas FM is laid back. FM is, we're all going to be cool. We're all going to. It really becomes the preferred radio of young people, because young people late at night, they want to sit around and they want to smoke whatever they're smoking and drink whatever they're drinking, and they don't want music kind of banging them on the head like you would find with AM radio. So there were distinct differences in the style and the music that was being played on the different types of radio. It's also during this time in the 70s and 80s where different types of radio, both on AM and FM, are emerging. And this is where radio starts to move into the specialized stage that we talked about before, as far as the three stages that media can go through. This is what's called format radio. That is a particular kind of programming for that's determined by the radio station itself. It picks out a particular audience that it wants to appeal to, and then it programs the music that audience is going to want to listen to. So the radio station itself is going to have a recognizable sound, and it's going to have a particular kind of personality. And really the kinds of formats that radio goes through, I'm sure you've heard some of these: country and western, oldies, rap, classical, talk radio. Yes, there are FM talk radio stations. News, sports, top 40. Classical also can mean classic rock types of formats. So radio stations are starting to determine what they want to sound like, and what kind of an audience they want to appeal to as they are moving into the specialized stage. The next big technological change is satellite radio. Again, up to this point, radio had been more of a terrestrial medium. That is, the transmitters, the antenna were stationed on the ground and were just sent out over the air to wherever there was a receiver, whether it was a transistor radio, whether it was a large radio in your grandmother's living room. The transmitters themselves were were terrestrial in that they stayed along the Earth's surface. Satellite radio is something that actually works to try and allow you as a customer to listen to your particular type of radio, your radio station, no matter where you are in the country. With terrestrial radio, you would have to be within 50, 60 miles of your favorite radio station or your favorite announcers. With satellite radio, you can go wherever you want in the country. As long as you have a subscription, you can listen to your favorite radio announcers, your favorite radio programs through satellite. So it's kind of similar to wireless telegraphy in that you have to have an encoder and a decoder on either end, but it's still going through, the signal itself is being transmitted through the air. At the encoder place, the radio signal is turned into a coded signal that's sent out from the Earth up towards the specific satellite. The satellite captures that, turns it around, and sends it back down towards Earth for the decoder, which is your radio, basically. And your radio turns it into sounds that you can listen to. Of course, what this means is you have to have a subscription. You have to pay, because it isn't open to anybody who wants it. You pay for the service that you get with satellite radio. The two that were so far have been the only ones that tried satellite radio are XM and Sirius. The technology that they were developing was approved by the Federal Communications Commission in 1997, and then XM launched in September of 2001, and Sirius launched in July of 2002. Now, the difference here is that there is no federal communication oversight as far as content. The FCC approves the technology because it is interstate communication, but as far as what kinds of radio are being transmitted, that's completely up to the transmitters. That's completely up to the satellite broadcasters, because it is a paid subscription, just like you have HBO or you have Showtime. The FCC has no control over that content. It has no oversight over that content. The same thing is true of satellite radio. Broadcast radio, the FCC does have control over content, and we'll get into that a little bit when we talk about issues and controversies related to radio. So if you are paying a subscription for satellite radio, you're getting it commercial free because the operation is dependent on money being paid through subscriptions, and any kind of format is available. It can be music, it can be sports, it can be news, it can be talk, even to the point of having sex conversations on radio. Yes, there have been sex channels on satellite radio, simply because there is no prohibition about anything as far as content with satellite radio. So anything goes, anything that anybody wants can be on satellite radio. Probably the biggest coup that satellite radio had was to sign one of the biggest radio personalities in the country to Sirius Radio, and that was Howard Stern. Howard Stern had been a broadcast radio DJ in various radio stations around the country. Primarily, the last days in broadcast were in New York, where he was a very controversial DJ. He was one of those known as a shock jock. He would put anything that he could on that would push that envelope of FCC oversight. And he always felt constrained about what he put on his radio programs because if he put on something that was unacceptable, the FCC would fine his radio station, and then his station would be angry at him. Yet at the same time, he was extremely popular. He had lots and lots of listeners and very high ratings all the time he was on broadcast radio. However, when Sirius came along and offered him a lot of money, he found that this was really where he wanted to go, because now he didn't have any FCC restraints. He could do what he wanted. He could say what he wanted. And so Sirius signed him to a contract that paid him $100 million per year. And his first show came on in January 9 of 2006. And as far as I know, he's still on satellite radio. And he brings up pretty much any kind of content that he wants. And he has been known to bring up very controversial issues, but at the same time have well-known personalities on his programs, including political candidates that will come and talk about pretty much anything that they want to, and anything that he can bring up for them. Unfortunately, satellite radio got to a certain point and then plateaued. It didn't really go any further, such that eventually the two satellite radio companies decided to think about merging. There were only two of them. There were those who were against this because, again, the idea would basically create a monopoly of satellite radio. The only two satellite radio channels available were now being merged into one company. And so there was question about that in Congress and with the FCC, but eventually that was approved, and Sirius and XM merged in 2008. And up to this point, again, their number of subscribers is still relatively stable. It hasn't really gone down. It hasn't really gone up. In fact, if you have some services, some entertainment services like HBO or Charter, or cable services, or satellite services like Dish or DirecTV, you get the programming that's made available by XM Radio, Sirius XM satellite radio. So they are making money that way, as well as through their single subscribers who can have this in their cars. They can have it on their computers, on their cell phones, and so they still will reach you pretty much wherever you are. So that's a look at where we are as far as modern radio is concerned. So the last part of this PowerPoint will be related to issues and controversies that radio has gone through over the decades.